A billionaire demanded his maid move in, but the truth about her broke him forever. The Sterling estate was a world of pristine order, a place where precision dictated every movement and mistakes were simply not tolerated. Damien Sterling built his empire on the foundation of control. Whether in business or in his personal life, he allowed no room for error. To those who worked for him, he was an enigma wrapped in steel, a man whose cold detachment made even the wealthiest and most powerful uneasy in his presence. His reputation as a ruthless businessman extended far beyond the walls of his grand estate, and within its halls, he was more than just a billionaire. He was law itself. Every command he gave was met with immediate action, and his staff knew better than to challenge him. Evelyn Moore had spent years perfecting the skill of going unnoticed. She had been at the estate long enough to know the rhythm of the house, to anticipate what needed to be done before it was spoken. She worked tirelessly, slipping in and out of rooms like a ghost, always present yet never seen. It was safer this way. The less attention she drew, the better. It had been years since she first arrived here, and in all that time, she had made sure to never step out of line, to never give Damien Sterling a reason to acknowledge her existence. He didn't need to know her name. He didn't need to look at her twice. That was how she survived. But the illusion of stability she had built for herself shattered the moment Damien returned from his overseas trip. He arrived unannounced, stepping into his estate only to be met with a household teetering on the edge of chaos. The usually spotless floors bore signs of neglect, the once efficient flow of the staff, now a tangled mess of miscommunication. His sharp gaze took in every imperfection, his jaw tightening with each detail that fell out of place. The air turned suffocating as the staff gathered in silence, bracing for the storm they knew was coming. And it came, swift, cold, and unforgiving. "Where's Margaret?" Damien's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The absence of his longtime housekeeper was the first thing he noticed, the first thing that sent his irritation spiking. She left, sir," one of the junior maids stammered, avoiding his gaze. "She resigned last week." Silence followed. Damien's expression darkened, the weight of the news settling in his chest like lead. Margaret had been with him for years, a pillar of efficiency in his otherwise unbending world. He did not tolerate disruptions, and her abrupt departure was the kind of disorder he despised. "And no one thought to inform me?" His voice was dangerously calm, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. The staff exchanged nervous glances, shrinking under the weight of his scrutiny. It was Evelyn who finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "The transition was handled internally, sir. There were no major disruptions." For the first time in years, Damien's gaze landed directly on her. Evelyn felt the weight of it, her heart hammering against her ribs as she forced herself to remain still. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, the first time he had acknowledged her existence beyond being just another worker in his estate. His eyes were sharp, unreadable, assessing her with the same scrutiny he applied to everything in his world. "And you are?" His tone was indifferent, as if she were nothing more than a misplaced file in his well-organized world. "Evelyn Moore, sir. I oversee the daily operations of the household." She kept her voice neutral, her posture composed despite the unease crawling up her spine. Damien didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered over her, calculating, considering. He had never paid attention to her before, and yet, in this moment, something about her presence caught his attention. The quiet confidence, the efficiency with which she spoke, it stood out. "From now on, you will move into the main house," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I want this estate back in order, and I want it done immediately." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years blending into the background, years making sure she was nothing more than a shadow in the grand halls of this estate. And now, with a single command, Damien Sterling had pulled her into the light. Panic surged beneath her composed exterior, but she nodded. "Understood, sir." That night, as she gathered her few belongings and moved into the mansion, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in her chest. She had spent years avoiding Damien Sterling, ensuring that their paths never crossed. Now, she was walking straight into the lion's den. She wasn't sure if she would make it out unscathed. The mansion felt different at night. It was quieter, heavier, as if the very walls bore the weight of the secrets held within them. Evelyn walked down the long corridor, gripping the small bag of her belongings tightly. She had lived on the estate for years, but never in the main house. It had always been a place she avoided, a place where power and wealth dictated every breath taken within its walls. Now, she was being forced into its very heart. Her new quarters were situated on the second floor, far too close to Damien's private wing for comfort. The room itself was grander than anything she had ever lived in before. Dark oak furniture, deep navy curtains, a chandelier hanging from the ceiling like something out of a dream. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't hers. This wasn't her space, wasn't her life. She had built a life of quiet solitude in the servants' quarters, a life that allowed her to remain unseen. But now, she had been thrust into a world where being invisible was no longer an option. She sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling slowly. It was fine. She would do her job, keep her head down, and stay out his way as much as possible. That had always been the rule, and she had no intention of breaking it now. But as the days passed, Evelyn realized that avoiding Damien Sterling was no longer an option. He was everywhere. His presence was an unshakable force, lingering in the halls, in the very air of the mansion. She wasn't sure if it was because she was now more exposed, or if he had simply become more aware of her presence. But their paths crossed far too often. Silent encounters in the vast hallways, fleeting glances in the grand dining room, where he often worked late into the night. Each moment felt heavier than it should. At first, she thought it was her own paranoia playing tricks on her. But then she began to notice the shift. Damien Sterling, a man who never noticed anyone unless they were of use to him, had begun to notice her. It started with small things. A pause when she entered a room. A glance held a second too long. A flicker of something in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, or something far more dangerous. Evelyn couldn't understand it. She wasn't supposed to be seen. One evening, as she went about her usual routine, she caught him watching her. She was in the study, making sure everything was in its proper place before the night ended, when she felt the weight of his gaze on her. She turned, her breath catching as she found him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're efficient," he said finally, his voice smooth yet laced with something that sent shivers down her spine. Evelyn forced herself to remain composed. "It's my job, sir." His gaze didn't waver. "No, Margaret was efficient. You're precise." The way he said it unsettled her. It wasn't just an observation. It was an assessment, a quiet study of who she was. She lowered her gaze, returning to her task. "Is there anything else you need?" There was a pause, one that stretched a little too long, before he finally pushed away from the doorway. "No, carry on." But she knew, even as he walked away, that something had shifted. The days that followed only proved her suspicions right. She could feel him watching her, noticing things that no one else ever had. The way she worked tirelessly without complaint, the way she moved through the house with quiet precision, the way her eyes held something deeper than she ever let on. He never said anything about it, never confronted her directly, but the tension between them grew with each passing day. And it terrified her. Evelyn had spent years making sure she was invisible, and now, the one man she had hoped would never notice her was beginning to see her far too clearly. One evening, as she was setting the dining table for dinner, she felt his presence before she even saw him. He moved silently, a habit of his, but something about the air always shifted when he was near. "Why do you do it?" His voice was calm, yet firm. She froze for a fraction of a second before forcing herself to continue arranging the plates. "Do what, sir?" "Work yourself to exhaustion." Her fingers tightened around the silverware. "It's my job." He stepped closer, and she felt the air around her grow thick. "That's not an answer." She exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral as she finally turned to face him. "I do what is expected of me." He studied her, his sharp eyes searching for something beneath her composed facade. For a moment, she thought he would push further, demand answers she wasn't ready to give. But then he simply nodded, and yet, she knew that wouldn't be the end of it. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized something dangerous. Damian Sterling was beginning to see her. And if he kept looking too closely, he might just uncover the one thing she had spent her entire life trying to hide. Damian Sterling was a man who prided himself on control. His life was built on discipline, efficiency, and the absolute certainty that everything had its place. Yet lately, something had disrupted that balance. Or rather, someone. Evelyn Moore. He didn't know why, but his eyes kept finding her. She never did anything to draw attention, yet somehow she stood out. Her movements were precise, her work flawless, and she spoke only when necessary. But it wasn't her efficiency that unsettled him. It was something else, something he couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was the quiet way she carried herself, the sadness that lingered around her like an invisible veil. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but now that he had noticed it, he couldn't seem to unsee it. She was different, not in an obvious way, not in a way he could point to and explain, but different nonetheless. And that bothered him. Damian had never been the type to concern himself with the lives of his staff. They were there to do their jobs, and as long as they did, he had no reason to care beyond that. But Evelyn, she was becoming a presence he couldn't ignore. He started noticing little things. The way she avoided his gaze whenever he was near. The way her hands sometimes trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking. The way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever someone got too close. It was as if she was constantly bracing for something. The more he observed her, the more questions he had. Who was she really? Why did she carry herself like a woman who was always preparing for the worst? And why did he care? It was a question that haunted him. One he refused to acknowledge even as he found himself watching her more than he should. His curiosity grew into something deeper, something bordering on obsession. He wanted to understand her, but Evelyn did not make it easy. She was a fortress, keeping everyone at a safe distance, offering nothing beyond what was necessary to keep the household running smoothly. She never engaged in idle conversation, never shared personal details, never slipped up. Yet, Damian could sense it. Something was hiding beneath her carefully composed exterior. Then, one night, he saw it. He had been working late in his study, reviewing documents, when he decided to step out for a brief moment. When he returned, he found Evelyn standing in the middle of the room, frozen before the fireplace. At first, he didn't understand what she was looking at. Then his gaze followed hers, and he saw it. The framed photograph sitting on the mantel. An old picture, one he had long since stopped noticing. He frowned. "What are you doing?" Evelyn startled, turning sharply, and in that moment, he saw something he had never seen before. Fear. Not the kind of fear his employees often felt when he was displeased. This was deeper, raw, almost desperate. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. Damian narrowed his eyes, suspicion curling in his chest. "Why are you looking at that picture?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her breathing was uneven, her entire body tense. He stepped forward, his tone quieter now, but no less firm. "You recognize it." Evelyn shook her head too quickly, the denial rushing from her lips. "No, I was just cleaning." She was lying. Damian had spent years studying people, reading between their words, understanding the language of silence. And right now, everything about her screamed that she was hiding something. His gaze flickered back to the photograph. It was old, taken years ago, back when things had been different. It showed him standing beside his father, the estate looming behind them. It was one of the few remnants of his past he had allowed to remain in his presence, though he never spared it much thought. Until now, Evelyn's reaction to it was too strong, too visceral. Why? The question lodged itself deep in his mind, refusing to let go. When he looked at her again, she had regained a sliver of composure. but her hands were still trembling at her sides. She was waiting for him to demand an explanation, waiting for him to call her out. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, watching her carefully. "Go," he said finally, his voice unreadable. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She turned and hurried out of the room, disappearing down the hallway as if she couldn't escape fast enough. But Damien didn't move. His gaze remained on the photograph, his mind spinning with thoughts he couldn't quite piece together. Something wasn't right, and for the first time in years, he felt the walls of his carefully controlled world begin to crack. Damien didn't sleep that night. The moment kept replaying in his mind. Evelyn standing in his study, her face pale, her entire body frozen as if she had seen a ghost. And perhaps, in a way, she had, because her reaction to that photograph had been too strong, too telling. There was no mistaking it. She had recognized it. But why? Evelyn had been working in his household for years, always quiet, always unnoticeable, always blending into the background. And yet, for the first time, she had slipped. For the first time, she had given him something to work with. Damien sat in his dimly lit study, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. His fingers drummed against the polished desk as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph. He had always thought of it as nothing more than a remnant of the past, a meaningless snapshot of a time that no longer mattered. But now it felt like a clue to a puzzle he didn't even know he was trying to solve. His instincts wouldn't let it go. He had built his empire on being ruthless, on knowing when something didn't add up. And Evelyn, quiet, unassuming Evelyn, was suddenly the biggest inconsistency in his perfectly structured world. He needed answers. The next morning, he watched her. Not openly, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but subtly. Evelyn was more guarded than ever, her every movement precise, her face carefully composed. But it wasn't enough. She avoided his gaze, her hands a little too steady, her expression a little too blank. She was being careful, and that only made him more certain that she was hiding something. Damien wasn't the type to let things go. When something piqued his curiosity, he pursued it until he had unraveled every last thread. So he started digging. It began with a simple request to his private investigator. Background checks were standard for every employee, but now he wanted hers revisited. He wanted every detail scrutinized. What he got back made his stomach tighten. There were gaps in her history, unanswered questions, places she should have been but wasn't, people who should have remembered her but didn't. It was as if parts of her past had been carefully erased, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure there were no loose ends. But no one could cover everything, and as Damien read through the report, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Something about her past felt familiar. But why? He pushed harder, instructing his investigator to go deeper, to dig past the surface, to find what had been buried. Because now, he was certain Evelyn Moore was not who she claimed to be, and he needed to know why she was here. The breaking point. Damien's patience had limits, and Evelyn was testing every single one of them. For days, he watched her, waiting for another slip-up, waiting for her to give him a reason to demand answers. But she was careful, too careful, until one night. It was late. The estate was quiet, the only sounds the distant rustling of trees outside. Damien had just finished a late meeting and was heading upstairs when he noticed something unusual. The door to his father's old study, the one he rarely entered, was slightly ajar. His body tensed. No one went in there. Not his staff, not his guests. It was an unspoken rule. He stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. The dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating a lone figure standing in front of the large wooden desk. Evelyn. His breath stilled. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused, too lost in whatever memory was gripping her. Her fingers hovered just above the surface of a desk, as if she wanted to touch it but couldn't. And her face. Damien had never seen her like this. Her expression wasn't the carefully guarded one she always wore. It was raw, pained, as if she was standing in the ruins of something she had once held dear. And then she turned slightly, and his gaze followed hers to the bookshelf behind the desk. His pulse kicked up. There, tucked between a row of old books, was another photograph. He had forgotten it was there. But now, as he took a slow step forward, he saw the way Evelyn's entire body stiffened. She knew that picture. She knew it. His voice was quiet, controlled. "What are you doing in here?" Evelyn flinched. She turned sharply, her wide eyes locking onto his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she did something he didn't expect. She closed her eyes for a brief second, as if bracing herself, and then she exhaled softly. And when she looked at him again, there was no more panic. No more pretense. Just quiet resignation. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words sent a jolt through him. His frown deepened. What? She didn't repeat herself. She just stood there waiting for him to put the pieces together. But the pieces didn't make sense. And yet, as he stared at her, something shifted in his mind, like a door cracking open, allowing distant echoes of a past he had long since buried to slip through. A past that had once been filled with pain. A past he had spent years trying to forget. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be here." And then she turned, brushing past him as she hurried out of the room. But this time, Damien didn't let her escape. He caught her wrist, his grip firm, but not harsh. No more running. His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. "You owe me the truth." Evelyn's body was rigid beneath his grasp, but when she lifted her gaze to meet his, something flickered in her eyes, something that sent an unfamiliar chill through him. Pain, regret, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to grief. He had spent years mastering the art of shutting people out, of ensuring that no one ever got close enough to hurt him again. But right now, standing in the dimly lit hallway, with Evelyn looking up at him like she was standing on the edge of something irreversible, Damien felt something crack open inside him. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to come next. The air between them was thick with tension. Damien's grip on Evelyn's wrist remained firm, not forceful, but unyielding, just enough to let her know that this time, she wouldn't slip away. Not again. Evelyn didn't try to pull away. She just stood there, frozen in place, her breath uneven, her eyes locked onto his. The resignation on her face, the way she seemed to brace herself for whatever was coming. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You owe me an explanation," he said, his voice low, controlled. She swallowed, and for the first time, he saw her hesitation waver. It was subtle, barely there, but he caught it, the flicker of something unspoken, something buried deep. She wasn't just afraid. She was hurting. But why? "I can't," she finally whispered. Damien's jaw tightened. That wasn't good enough. "You don't get to say that," he said. "Not after all this." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "You know something? Something about me, about my past. And I need to know what it is." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, wanted to tell him the truth, but something held her back. Something bigger than fear. Damien had seen plenty of lies in his life, had dealt with people who had mastered the art of deception. But Evelyn, she wasn't lying. She was protecting something, or someone, and that realization sent a cold sensation creeping through his veins. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. "Who are you, Evelyn?" His voice was softer this time, but no less demanding. A flicker of pain crossed her features. And then, just as quickly, she shut it down. "I'm no one," she whispered. "Liar." Before he could say anything else, she gently pulled her wrist free. This time, he let her go. She took a step back, her eyes lingering on his for a second longer than they should have. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Damien didn't stop her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. Not even close. The past that refuses to stay buried. Sleep was impossible that night. Damien sat in his study, the dim glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. His hands were clenched into fists, his mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. Evelyn knew something about him, and it wasn't just a coincidence. He reached for the photograph, the one she had been staring at so intently. It was old, the edges slightly worn, a relic from a time he had long since locked away. But now, as he stared at it, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Something was wrong. His memories of that time were hazy at best, pieces of a life he had tried to forget, a time before he had built his empire, before he had hardened himself against the world. But Evelyn, she had looked at this picture like it meant something, like it had broken her, and that realization left an uneasy feeling in his gut. He had always prided himself on knowing everything, on being in control. But right now, he felt like he was standing in the dark, grasping at something just out of reach. He needed answers, and he was done waiting for Evelyn to give them to him. A search for the truth. The next morning, Damien wasted no time. His private investigator had already uncovered inconsistencies in Evelyn's past, but now, Damien needed more. He made the call. Find everything. No detail is too small. He wasn't going to stop until he knew exactly who she was. By evening, the first results came in, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A name, a place, a connection he hadn't expected. Evelyn Moore wasn't just some random maid who had happened to end up in his household. She was tied to his past, to a part of his life he had buried so deep, he had almost forgotten it. Almost, but not entirely. The details were fragmented, pieces of a story that didn't yet make sense. But one thing was clear. Evelyn's presence in his life wasn't an accident. She had come back for a reason, and now he had no choice but to find out what it was. A reckoning he didn't see coming. The moment Damien stepped into the main hall, he spotted her. Evelyn. She was standing by the grand staircase, her posture rigid, her fingers gripping the railing as if she needed something to hold on to. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a brief second, he just watched her. Watched the way she exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. Watched the way her shoulders trembled just slightly before she forced herself to stand tall. She was preparing for something. So was he. His footsteps were slow, deliberate as he closed the distance between them. The moment she heard him, she stiffened. But she didn't turn around. Not until he spoke. I know who you are. The words were quiet, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Evelyn's entire body went still. And then, after a long moment, she finally turned. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, Damien saw everything. The truth, the pain, the weight of whatever secret she had been carrying all this time. His voice was steady, but beneath it, there was something else. Something raw. Why didn't you tell me? Evelyn swallowed hard. Because I knew what would happen if I did. His fists clenched. And what's that? She held his gaze, her own eyes dark with something he couldn't quite name. You'd hate me. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Damien took a step closer. Why would I hate you? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. But then, with a soft, almost broken sigh, she said the words that shattered everything he thought he knew. Because I'm the reason you lost everything. Silence. Damien's breath stilled. His pulse pounded. The ground beneath him felt like it had disappeared. And for the first time in years, Damien Whitmore, the man who never lost control, never let anything shake him, felt his world tilt sideways. This wasn't just about a secret. This wasn't just about the past. This was about something much bigger. And whatever it was about to change everything. The weight of Evelyn's words settled over Damien like a crushing force, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. He stood motionless, his mind refusing to process the truth that had just left her lips. She had been part of his life before, not as an outsider, not as a stranger, but as someone who once mattered, someone who had meant everything. Yet, he had no memory of it, no recollection of the love she claimed they once shared. His throat felt dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was mistaken, that there was no way he could have forgotten something so important. But the look in her eyes, the quiet devastation in her voice, told him she wasn't lying. This wasn't some cruel trick or a desperate attempt to manipulate him. It was real, and it changed everything. Evelyn stood before him, her posture rigid, as if she had spent years preparing for this moment, for the chance to finally say the words she had held inside for so long. Yet, now that they were out in the open, she looked just as lost as he felt. Her fingers trembled at her sides, her chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. She had expected resistance, disbelief, maybe even anger. But she hadn't expected the sheer emptiness in his gaze, the way he seemed to be searching for something he simply couldn't find. "I loved you once," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you loved me." The words sent a sharp pain through his chest, like a blade piercing through layers of armor he hadn't even realized he had built. He searched his mind, desperate for a glimpse of the past she was speaking of, a flash of a memory, a feeling, anything that could prove she was telling the truth. But there was nothing, just a gaping hole where something should have been. It was as if someone had stolen a part of his life, erased it from existence, leaving behind only the man he had become, the man who had no place for love, for tenderness, for anything beyond power and ambition. His silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. He didn't know what to say, how to respond. How did a person react to being told they had once belonged to a love they couldn't even remember? How did he justify the fact that he had forgotten someone who had clearly never forgotten him? Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Before everything changed. Before you changed." Her gaze softened, something almost sorrowful flickering in her eyes. "We were just kids, Damien, young and foolish, dreaming of a future we thought was ours to take." A bitter smile crossed her lips, gone just as quickly as it appeared. "But we were wrong, weren't we?" His hands curled into fists at his sides, frustration tightening every muscle in his body. He hated this, hated the feeling of being blindsided, of being made to face something he had no control over. He had spent his entire life ensuring that nothing caught him off guard, that no one held power over him. But right now Evelyn did, and it terrified him. "I don't remember," he finally admitted, his voice hollow. She nodded as if she had expected that. "I know." Her calm acceptance only made it worse. It would have been easier if she had been angry, if she had accused him, demanded answers from him. But she didn't. She simply stood there, a living reminder of a past he had somehow erased. And that was the worst part, because it meant that at some point he had chosen to forget her. The realization unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He prided himself on his ability to recall every detail, every moment that had shaped him into the man he was today. But here she was, telling him that there had been another version of himself, a version that had loved her, that had made promises and whispered dreams of forever. And he had thrown it all away. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough. "Tell me everything." Evelyn hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. But then she exhaled, as if resigning herself to the inevitable. "You were different then," she began, her voice softer now, tinged with a quiet nostalgia. "Not the ruthless billionaire everyone fears today. You were just Damien, stubborn, ambitious, but full of dreams. You wanted so much more than the world was willing to give you." Her lips quirked slightly, as if remembering something fond. "And you swore that no matter what, you'd take it. You'd build an empire so powerful that no one could ever take anything from you again." He listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. The version of himself she spoke of felt distant, almost unrecognizable. He had always been driven, always wanted more, but he couldn't imagine a time when he had been anything other than what he was now. "And I was there," Evelyn continued, her voice growing quieter. "By your side, every step of the way. I believed in you, Damien, even when no one else did." Her gaze darkened, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. "I loved you with everything I had, and you loved me." She paused, her throat working as she swallowed. "Or at least I thought you did." Something in her tone sent a cold shiver down his spine, a prelude to the part of the story he wasn't ready to hear. "What happened?" he asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be one he wanted. Evelyn's eyes met his, filled with something raw, something that cut deeper than any words ever could. "You left," she said simply. "You made a choice, and it wasn't me." The finality in her voice sent a sharp pain through his chest. He had expected anger, accusations, maybe even resentment. But there was none of that, just quiet acceptance, as if she had already relived this moment 1,000 times before, as if she had long since given up on hoping he would remember. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He wasn't sure if it was from frustration or something deeper, something dangerously close to regret. He couldn't remember making that choice, couldn't recall walking away from her, from whatever they had shared. But the fact remained, he had done it. And now, he had to face the consequences. "Why didn't you try to find me?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. It was unfair, he knew that. But he needed to know. If she had loved him so much, why had she let him go? Evelyn's lips parted slightly, then closed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something almost broken underneath. "Because you didn't give me a reason to," she said. "You made your choice, Damien. You never looked back." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. He had always believed that everything he had sacrificed was necessary, that every choice he had made had been for the sake of building the life he had now. But as he stood there, facing the woman he had once loved and abandoned, he realized something chilling. He hadn't just sacrificed his past, he had destroyed it. And now, he wasn't sure if he could ever get it back. Silence hung heavy between them, thick and suffocating. Damien's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but his mind remained a battlefield of chaos. He wanted to argue, to challenge Evelyn's words, but deep down, he knew he had no defense. He had walked away from her. He had forgotten her, and she had lived with the consequences while he had gone on with his life, blind to the wreckage he had left behind. Evelyn exhaled slowly, looking down as if gathering the strength to continue. "Do you want to know the worst part?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes burning with a pain she had buried for years. "It wasn't just that you left. It was how easy it was for you to forget." Her words struck him harder than he anticipated, as if she had reached into his chest and crushed something vital. A strange, unfamiliar sensation swelled inside him, an ache he couldn't name, a guilt he didn't know how to carry. He had always believed himself to be in control of his emotions, of his actions. But now, standing before Evelyn, hearing her say those words, he felt powerless. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I don't." He hesitated, struggling against the weight of his own ignorance. "I don't remember any of this." She nodded, as if she had long accepted that answer. "I know." It should have been a relief that she wasn't angry, that she wasn't screaming at him or demanding retribution. But somehow, her quiet acceptance made it worse. It meant that she had already mourned the loss of what they had, that she had given up on him long before this moment. Damien ran a hand through his hair, frustration clawing at his insides. "Evelyn, if what you're saying is true." "If," she cut in sharply, her voice finally showing a hint of the emotions she had kept at bay. "Do you really think I would make something like this up?" "No," he admitted, shaking his head. He exhaled, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know how this is possible. How could I forget something so important?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her tone softer now. "Because you chose to." His breath hitched. "You wanted power, Damien," she continued, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of sadness. "You wanted to prove yourself to the world. And to do that, you had to let go of anything that made you weak." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "And you think loving you made me weak?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them before finally saying, "I think loving me made you human, and you didn't want to be human anymore." The words lodged in his throat like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, that he had never seen love as a weakness. But deep down, a part of him feared she was right. Hadn't he spent years convincing himself that emotions only got in the way? That attachment led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to destruction? "I waited for you," Evelyn murmured, her voice filled with a quiet resignation. "For months, I told myself you would come back, that you would realize what you had done. But you never did. And one day, I understood why." She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "You didn't need me anymore." Damien's stomach twisted violently. It was the kind of pain he wasn't used to, one that wasn't physical, but just as brutal. He had spent his entire life making sure he never had to feel things like this. Regret, guilt, the suffocating weight of knowing he had hurt someone who had once loved him unconditionally. "You said I left," he said after a long pause. "Tell me how. Tell me everything." Evelyn hesitated. For the first time, he saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, as if she wasn't sure whether it was worth reliving. But then she squared her shoulders and spoke. "We met when we were young," she began. "You had nothing but ambition, and I had nothing but hope. You were the boy who swore you'd conquer the world, and I was the girl who believed in you even when no one else did." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "We were inseparable, Damien. It didn't matter that you came from nothing or that I had even less. We were just two people who thought love was enough." Her expression darkened. But love wasn't enough, was it? He stayed silent, unable to find the words. "You started changing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The moment you got your first taste of success, it was like something shifted inside you. You stopped talking about our future and started talking about your future. You worked longer hours, met people I never even knew existed. You started making decisions that I wasn't a part of." She inhaled sharply, as if steadying herself. "And then one day, you told me you had to let me go." His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "I said that." She nodded. "You said I didn't fit into the life you were building, that you couldn't afford distractions, that love wasn't something a man like you could afford." Damien flinched as if she had struck him. "You told me to move on," she said, her voice quieter now. "So I did." The words felt like a punch to the gut. He tried to picture himself saying those things, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember. It was like staring at a blank canvas where a masterpiece should have been. "You really don't remember, do you?" she asked, searching his face for something, anything, that might tell her otherwise. He shook his head slowly. "No," she sighed, as if she had expected nothing less. "Then maybe it doesn't matter anymore." But it did. It mattered more than anything, because the woman standing in front of him, the one he had dismissed as just another face in his world, was someone he had once promised forever to, and he had thrown it all away. A deep, suffocating guilt settled over him. He had spent years building an empire, believing that everything he had sacrificed had been worth it. But now, standing in front of the woman who had once loved him, who had once been his world, he wasn't so sure anymore. For the first time in his life, Damien Whitmore didn't know if he had won or lost. And for the first time, he was afraid to find out. Damien's chest felt tight, a weight pressing down on him that he didn't know how to shake off. He had built his life on logic, on decisions that made sense, cold, calculated, and devoid of weakness. But Evelyn's words unraveled something inside him, something raw and unfamiliar. How had he been so blind? How had he abandoned her without a second thought and then erased her from his memory, as if she had never existed? He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to force himself to breathe through the storm raging inside him. "Evelyn." His voice was rough, uncertain in a way that felt foreign to him. "I don't know what to say." A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "There's nothing to say, Damien. It was a long time ago. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter." She let out a soft sigh, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "It only matters if you want it to." The truth was, he wasn't sure what he wanted. He had spent years living a life where emotions were a weakness, where attachments were liabilities. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a woman who had once been his everything, drowning in a sense of loss so profound it felt like he was suffocating. Damien swallowed hard, his mind racing through the fragments of memories he couldn't access. "I don't understand how I could forget something like this," he admitted, frustration laced in his voice. Evelyn's gaze softened. "Because you chose to." It was the second time she had said those words, and they cut even deeper this time. "I don't remember making that choice," he said quietly. "Does it matter?" she asked. "The outcome was the same. You left. You built the life you wanted. And she trailed off for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I survived." The way she said it made something twist painfully inside him. She had survived. Not thrived, not moved on effortlessly, but survived. And it was because of him. A thick silence stretched between them. Damien wanted to say something, anything, but he wasn't sure where to begin. Finally, Evelyn exhaled and turned slightly, glancing toward the window. "I never told you this," she murmured. "But the night you left, I waited." His throat went dry. "Waited for what?" "For you to change your mind." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I sat by the phone, waiting for it to ring. I told myself that you'd realize what a mistake you were making, that you'd come back before it was too late." She shook her head. "But you never did." Damien's stomach twisted violently. He could see it now, the younger version of Evelyn, sitting in some dimly lit room, her heart breaking with every passing second. And him? He had been somewhere else, climbing his way to the top, never once looking back. "I was stupid back then," she continued. "I thought love was enough to make people stay." Damien felt like someone had punched him in the gut, because at one point, he must have believed that too. He must have believed in their love, in their future, in her. So why had he given it all up? He struggled to process it, to reconcile the ruthless man he had become with the one she was describing, the one who had once loved her so deeply. It felt like she was talking about a stranger. "Tell me more," he said suddenly. "I need to know everything." Evelyn hesitated. "Why?" "Because I need to understand." His voice was firmer now, more certain. "I can't change the past, but I refuse to accept that I was that person without knowing why." She studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was worth the effort. Then she nodded. "You weren't always like this, Damien," she said. "You used to laugh. You used to dream about things that had nothing to do with money or power. You used to hold my hand and tell me that nothing in this world mattered as long as we had each other." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "You were different." Damien barely recognized the man she was describing. She continued, her voice softer now. "We were happy. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And for the longest time, that was enough." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to remember those stolen moments, those whispered dreams. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind remained a void, a cruel reminder of what he had erased. "Then you got your first big break," Evelyn said, her expression darkening. "And everything changed." Damien swallowed hard. He knew exactly when that moment had been. The first deal, the first taste of success. The moment he had stepped into a world that had no place for weakness. "You started working late nights," she went on. "You stopped coming home as often. And when you did, it was like you weren't really there anymore." Her voice was quiet, but the pain in it was unmistakable. "And then, one day, you told me that you had to let me go." His entire body tensed. "I said those words." She nodded. "You said you couldn't afford distractions." Damien felt sick. "I didn't understand it then," Evelyn admitted. "I thought I had done something wrong. I kept asking myself what I could have done differently, how I could have made you stay. But the truth is, I never stood a chance." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady himself. "Evelyn, don't." She cut him off gently. "You don't owe me anything, Damien. Not an apology, not an explanation. It was a long time ago. But that was the problem. He did owe her something. He owed her the truth." He forced himself to meet her gaze. "I don't know who I was back then," he admitted, "but I know who I am now. And the man standing in front of you regrets every single thing he did to you." Her expression softened for just a fraction of a second before she shook her head. "Regret doesn't change the past." "No," he agreed. "But maybe it can change the future." Evelyn studied him carefully, as if trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. Then she let out a quiet sigh. "The future, Damien? What does that even mean for us?" The question hit him hard, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of the answer. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to let her go again. Not this time. Damien wasn't the kind of man who begged. He had built his empire on power, on control, on the ability to walk away from anything and anyone that did not serve his ambitions. And yet, standing in front of Evelyn now, he realized just how fragile all of it was. Because for the first time in his life, he had something to lose that wasn't tied to wealth or status. It was her. And the worst part? He had already lost her once before. He could feel the weight of that reality pressing down on him like a crushing force, suffocating in its intensity. The past few days had been a blur of emotions he didn't know how to process. He was a man who thrived in chaos, who found solutions before problems could even fully form. But this was different. Evelyn wasn't a business deal he could negotiate or a competitor he could outmaneuver. She was a woman who had once given him everything, only to be discarded when he had convinced himself he no longer needed her. And now, she was standing before him, whole in a way that had nothing to do with him. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing she had survived without him, that she had built a life where he was nothing more than a distant memory. But he wasn't ready to accept that. He couldn't. He had spent years convincing himself that his choices had been necessary, that his rise to the top had required sacrifices. But looking at her now, he wondered if he had given up the one thing that had ever truly mattered. The thought terrified him. More than that, it enraged him, because no matter how much he tried to tell himself otherwise, no matter how much he fought against the truth, the fact remained. He still loved her. He had never stopped. "Evelyn," he said, his voice tight with emotion he barely knew how to contain. "I need you to hear me." She sighed, shaking her head. "Damien, don't." "No," he cut in sharply, taking a step closer. "I know you don't believe me. I know you have no reason to. But I swear to you, I am not the same man who left you behind." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's the thing, Damien. I don't even know who that man was anymore." Her words stung more than he expected. He had thought the pain of his past choices couldn't cut any deeper, but she had just proven him wrong. And yet, he refused to back down. "I remember nothing," he admitted, his frustration evident. "I remember nothing about what we had, about what I threw away. And do you know how that feels?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like I lost something I can never get back. Like I destroyed something before I even realized how valuable it was." Evelyn's expression flickered with something. Hesitation, doubt, maybe even regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same unreadable mask she had worn since the moment she revealed the truth. "Damien," she said softly, "this isn't about what you remember. It's about what you did." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I know." A silence stretched between them, heavy with things left unsaid. "I should hate you," she whispered. "I should have spent every moment of these past years cursing your name. But I didn't." Something in his chest clenched painfully. "Why?" "Because I loved you too much to waste my life hating you." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I let you go a long time ago, Damien. I had to." The finality in her voice sent a wave of panic crashing over him. He wasn't sure what he had expected. For her to crumble under the weight of the past. For her to admit she had spent years waiting for him to come back. That was foolish. Evelyn was stronger than that. She had moved forward in a way that he never had, and the thought of her slipping away from him again was unbearable. "Tell me there's nothing left," he demanded. "Tell me that you feel absolutely nothing for me, and I'll walk away." Her lips parted slightly, her breath hitching for just a fraction of a second. But then she steeled herself, her expression unreadable. "I can't do this, Damien." It wasn't an answer, and he knew it. But it was enough to make his pulse quicken, to ignite a dangerous hope inside him. Because if she truly felt nothing, she would have said so. But she hadn't. Evelyn took a step back, as if physically putting distance between them would help her escape the weight of everything left unresolved. "I have to go. Evelyn, please." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Just let me go." He should have. Every rational part of him told him to do exactly that. But he couldn't. Not this time. "Not again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't walk away again." Evelyn's eyes met his for a brief moment before she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with nothing but the echo of her absence. And for the first time in his life, Damien Whitmore, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had conquered everything in his path, felt utterly, completely powerless. But one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. Not this time. Damien didn't leave. Even as Evelyn walked away, even as her presence faded into the night, he stood there, his mind a battlefield of emotions he could no longer suppress. His whole life had been about control, controlling his fate, his success, his surroundings. But he had never truly controlled what mattered most. He had let it slip through his fingers, discarded it as if it were an afterthought. And now, he was paying the price. For years, he had convinced himself that love was a weakness, that it had no place in the ruthless world he lived in. But Evelyn, she had been different. She had been the one thing he hadn't realized he needed until she was gone. And standing there now, with the truth crashing down on him like an unstoppable wave, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't giving up. He spent the next few days in a haze of restless thoughts, his mind unwilling to focus on anything other than the woman who had once held his heart. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he understood his own past. His memories of Evelyn were gone, erased by time, but the emotions? The emotions were still there, raw and undeniable. For the first time in years, he took a step back from his relentless pursuit of power and success. He dug through old files, traced back his own history, trying to find anything that would explain how he had let Evelyn slip away. And as he did, a darker truth began to emerge, one that sent a cold chill through his veins. His departure from Evelyn hadn't been entirely his own doing. He had always believed he had chosen ambition over love, that he had simply walked away. But the deeper he looked, the more he uncovered pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed. There had been outside forces, people who had ensured that Evelyn was removed from his life without him ever realizing it. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he made a call he never thought he would make. When a line clicked, a familiar voice answered. "Damien, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He didn't waste time. "Tell me the truth, father." A pause. Then the older man sighed. "Truth about what?" "Evelyn Carter." Another silence. Damien clenched his jaw. He could hear the subtle shift in his father's breathing, the slight hesitation. And he knew. "You knew her," Damien continued, his voice sharper now. "You knew about us, and you made sure I forgot her." His father's voice remained calm, but there was a distinct edge of warning in his tone. "Son, you're on the path to something greater. That girl would have held you back. I simply ensured you didn't make a mistake that would cost you your future." A wave of fury crashed over Damien, burning hotter than anything he had felt in years. "You manipulated me. You took something from me that wasn't yours to take." His father sighed. "You were young, impulsive. You would have thrown everything away for a woman who had no place in our world. I did what needed to be done." Damien's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "You had no right." "I had every right," his father countered. "You think you built this empire on your own? You think you got where you are by accident? I guided you, Damien. I shaped you into the man you needed to be. And that meant making sacrifices." A bitter laugh escaped Damien's lips. "Sacrifices? You mean you decided for me? You made me abandon the only person who ever truly mattered." "She was a distraction," his father said coldly. "And if you're smart, you'll let this go." But Damien wasn't listening anymore. His mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. His father had orchestrated it all, pushed Evelyn out of his life, erased any trace of her from his memory, made sure he never looked back. And he had fallen right into the trap. He ended the call without another word, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent years believing he had made the choice to leave Evelyn behind. But now he knew the truth. He had never truly left her. She had been stolen from him. The realization sent a fresh wave of urgency through him. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. But he could fight for what was still in front of him. He could fight for Evelyn. For them. That night, he found himself outside her apartment. He didn't even remember driving there, his body simply moving on instinct. He knocked, his pulse a steady, unrelenting rhythm in his ears. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "Damien," he exhaled slowly. "I know why I left you." Evelyn's expression hardened. "I don't need to hear this again." "No," he said quickly, stepping forward. "You do, because it wasn't my choice." She frowned, confusion flickering across her features. "What are you talking about?" "My father," he said, his voice laced with anger. "He orchestrated everything. He made sure I walked away from you. He took you from me." Evelyn's breath caught. "What?" "I don't remember what we had," Damien admitted, his voice raw. but I know now that I never would have left you on my own. He made sure I did. He manipulated me into believing I had to choose between you and my future. And I let him. Evelyn stared at him, disbelief warring with something deeper, something dangerously close to hope. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto hers. I can't change the past. I can't erase what I did. But I can tell you this. I would have never left you if I had known the truth. Her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of his words. Damien, I know I don't deserve another chance, he continued. I know I don't have a right to ask for one. But I need you to know I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I would have chosen you, that I still choose you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move, didn't say anything. Tell me I'm too late, he whispered. Tell me there's no part of you that wants to believe in us again, and I'll walk away. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they had lost. And then, finally she spoke. I don't know if I can trust you, Damien. His heart clenched, but he nodded. Then let me earn it. She exhaled shakily, her guard still firmly in place. But she didn't push him away. And for the first time in years, Damien felt something other than regret. Hope. Evelyn didn't know what to say. She had spent years forcing herself to bury the pain, to accept that Damien had chosen his world over her. And now, with one conversation, he had shattered everything she thought she knew about their past. It should have changed things. It should have made it easier to forgive him. But it didn't, because the truth didn't erase the damage. It didn't undo the years of heartbreak, the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the strength she had to build just to survive without him. She had learned how to live without him. And now, he was asking her to let him back in. I don't know if I can do this, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's gaze never wavered. I won't rush you, Evelyn. I won't push. But I'm not walking away again. His words sent a sharp ache through her chest. There had been a time when she would have given anything to hear him say those words. But now, she wasn't sure if she could afford to believe them. Damien had always been a man of action. When he wanted something, he went after it relentlessly. And right now, he wanted her. But what happened when the fight was over? When there was no longer an obstacle between them? Would he grow bored? Would he realize he wasn't built for love after all? I don't need grand gestures, she said finally, her voice steadier now. I don't need promises you might not keep. If you want to be in my life, Damien, you have to be in it for the right reasons. Not because of guilt, not because you suddenly realized what you lost. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. I'm here because I can't be anywhere else. I don't care what it takes. I'll prove to you that this isn't temporary, that I'm not the same man who let you go. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but belief was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. She had spent too long surviving on her own to let herself be broken again. So she did the only thing she could. She nodded, but she didn't open the door any wider. She didn't let him in. Not yet. If you really mean that, she said softly, then you'll have to prove it. Damien didn't hesitate. I will. Then, slowly, he stepped back, his gaze lingering on hers for a long moment before he turned and walked away. Evelyn closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if she had just made the right decision or the biggest mistake of her life. Damien didn't expect it to be easy. If anything, he had expected Evelyn to slam the door in his face, to tell him he was too late. The fact that she hadn't meant something. But he also knew words weren't enough. She had spent years believing he had abandoned her, and nothing he said could erase that overnight. So he did what he had never done before. He waited. For weeks, he respected the boundaries she had set, showing up only when she allowed it. He didn't bombard her with apologies or empty promises. Instead, he made sure she saw his presence, felt it, knew that this time he wasn't disappearing. It was in the small things, like showing up at the coffee shop she worked at, quietly supporting her without demanding anything in return. He asked about her life, her dreams, not just out of obligation, but because he wanted to know the woman she had become. And slowly, Evelyn started to let her guard down. At first, it was just polite conversations, small exchanges that barely scratched the surface. But then, one evening, as they sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, she asked him something she hadn't dared to before. "Do you regret it?" Damien looked at her, his jaw tightening. "Regret what?" "Choosing that life," she said. "Even if your father forced your hand. Do you regret building the empire you have now?" He exhaled slowly, considering his answer. "For a long time, I didn't. I convinced myself that success was the only thing that mattered, that everything I sacrificed was worth it." He met her gaze. "But then I saw you again, and I realized none of it meant anything if I had to lose you to get it." Evelyn didn't look away. "So what now?" "What do you mean? You built your life on control, on power. And now, you're telling me you want something different." She tilted her head. "Can you really walk away from all of it?" Damien hesitated, not because he doubted his answer, but because he knew it wasn't simple. "I don't know if I can walk away from everything," he admitted. "But I do know that if I had to choose between my empire and you, I wouldn't make the same mistake twice." Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "That's easy to say now, but what happens when things get hard? When your world pulls you back in?" Damien leaned forward, his expression unshakable. "Then I fight. For you. For us." Her chest ached at the conviction in his voice. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But belief was still terrifying. So instead of answering, she simply looked away, focusing on the steam rising from her cup. Damien didn't push. He just waited. Days turned into weeks, and something began to shift between them. Evelyn no longer tensed every time she saw him. She no longer kept their conversation short or avoided his gaze. And then, one evening, after a long shift at the cafe, she found herself sitting beside him on a park bench, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For a moment, they didn't speak. Then, softly, Evelyn whispered, "I wanted to hate you." Damien turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to hate you for so long," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "It would have been easier if I did." His chest tightened. "Evelyn, I convinced myself that you didn't care, that you had never loved me at all." She let out a small, broken laugh. "But the truth is, I never stopped loving you, even when I tried." Damien reached for her hand, hesitating for the first time. And when she didn't pull away, he intertwined his fingers with hers, holding on as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded. "You don't have to forgive me," he murmured. "You don't have to let me in. But I will spend the rest of my life proving that I was never meant to be without you." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from the past. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let it go. Evelyn knew it had to end. No matter how much she wanted to believe in second chances, no matter how deeply her heart still ached for him, some wounds simply didn't heal. She had spent too many years waiting, hoping, only to teach herself how to survive without him. Now, when he finally stood before her, stripped of his arrogance and power, she realized that the damage ran deeper than words could fix. It wasn't about whether he had changed. It was about whether she could ever let go of the pain. The decision weighed heavily on her chest as she stood in the doorway of the mansion, staring at the place that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. This was where she had rediscovered the man she once loved, but it was also where she had relived every heartbreak. She couldn't stay. If she did, she would be trapped in an endless cycle of doubt, waiting for the day he might choose his empire over her once again. She packed in silence, stuffing her clothes into a worn suitcase, her fingers trembling as she folded the last remnants of a life she had tried so hard to piece together. Every item she touched felt like a memory pressing down on her, whispering all the what-ifs she couldn't afford to consider. She had spent years dreaming of this love, of the moment he would fight for her, but now that it had finally come, it wasn't enough. Love alone couldn't erase the past. Damien stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her. He hadn't tried to stop her, hadn't begged her to stay. The old Damien, the one who thrived on control, who thought he could manipulate fate itself, would have never let her leave. But this version of him? He simply stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his expression unreadable. She expected anger. Please. A desperate attempt to change her mind. Instead, he gave her nothing but silence. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. "You're really leaving," he said at last, his voice hoarse. She forced herself to nod. "I have to." His throat worked as if he were trying to swallow words he couldn't say. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "I won't stop you." Something inside her cracked. She didn't know if she wanted him to fight for her, or if she had just been waiting for proof that he truly had changed. She looked down, gripping the handle of her suitcase. "Goodbye, Damien." He didn't say the words back. He only watched as she walked past him, his silence wrapping around her like a ghost that would never let her go. She made it to the front steps before the tears started. The city lights stretched before her, endless and unforgiving, a reminder that the world kept moving even when hearts broke. She told herself she would be okay. She had survived losing him once before. She could do it again. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time, something was different. The news came 2 days later. Evelyn had been trying to settle into her new life, throwing herself into work, avoiding every reminder of the past. But Damien's name was impossible to escape. His empire was built into the fabric of the city, his presence inescapable. No matter how far she ran, he was always there. On billboards, in newspapers, in the murmurs of business tycoons discussing his latest moves. Except, this time, the whispers were different. She overheard it at a coffee shop, 2 men in expensive suits murmuring in hushed tones. "Did you hear? Whitmore pulled out of the Lazen deal." "What? That was worth billions. Why the hell would he walk away?" No one knows. But whatever the reason, it cost him more than just money. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she listened, the words replaying in her mind. Damien had given up a deal that could have secured his legacy for generations. And he had done it without a word, without any grand announcements. She didn't want to care. She didn't want to question why he had done it. But the truth gnawed at her, forcing her to confront a possibility she wasn't ready to face. Was this his way of proving himself? She told herself it didn't matter. She had made her choice. But deep down, something inside her was unraveling. Days passed, but the weight of Damien's actions refused to fade. Evelyn tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it wasn't her concern. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. Damien had spent his entire life building his empire, sacrificing everything, including her, to secure his place at the top. And now, when he finally had everything he ever wanted, he had walked away from one of the biggest deals of his career. It didn't make sense. Unless the deal was tied to the very thing that had destroyed them all those years ago. Her heart pounded as she thought back to their past, to the betrayals that had forced them apart. Damien had always believed his choices had been his own, but what if they hadn't been? What if someone had manipulated him, twisted his hand until he had no choice but to let her go? She couldn't ignore it any longer. With shaky hands, she reached for her phone and dialed the number she swore she would never call again. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Evelyn." Her throat tightened. "Damien, I need to know the truth." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, finally, he said, "Come to me, and I'll tell you everything." She hesitated, fear and longing warring inside her. But in the end, the need for answers was stronger than the need to protect herself. "I'll be there." And as she hung up, she realized this wasn't just about Damien anymore. This was about finally uncovering the truth that had stolen everything from them. Evelyn stepped out of the car, her hands trembling as she stared up at the familiar mansion. It looked the same as the night she had left, but something felt different. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was the realization that this time she wasn't here as a girl waiting to be chosen. She was here because she demanded the truth. The doors were already open when she walked inside, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Damien stood at the far end of the grand foyer, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't rush to her. He didn't try to close the distance between them. He simply waited, as if he knew that this moment wasn't his to control. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Why did you walk away from the deal?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. Because it was the same people who forced me to leave you all those years ago. Evelyn's breath hitched. My father, my board, the people who decided that my future was more important than my happiness, he continued. I thought I was making my own choices back then, but I wasn't. I was being controlled, manipulated, and I let them convince me that you weren't worth the risk. She swallowed, her heart pounding. And now, he took a slow step forward. Now I see the truth. I see that I should have fought for you, no matter the cost. And when I saw that they were trying to control me again, trying to force me into another decision that would compromise everything I believe in, I finally did what I should have done back then. Evelyn's eyes burned with unshed tears. You gave up everything. Damien nodded. Because I wanted to prove to them, to myself, to you, that my love for you is never about power or money or winning. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I let you go because I thought it was the only way to show you that my love isn't selfish anymore. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the moment she had once begged for. But now that it was here, now that she had the answers she had been searching for, she realized something. It wasn't about Damien choosing her. It was about her choosing him. She had spent so many years wondering if he would ever fight for her, if he would ever see that she was worth more than his empire. But now, standing before him, she saw that the real choice had always been hers. Could she trust him? Could she open her heart again, knowing the pain he had once caused? Slowly, she stepped closer. Damien tensed, his breath hitching, but he didn't move, didn't try to reach for her. He was truly letting her decide. Evelyn looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had once held so much ambition, so much hunger for success. But now they held something different, something raw, something real. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. This time, I choose you, she whispered. Damien's breath shuddered out of him, as if he had been holding it for years. His hand tightened around hers, his other hand coming up to cradle her face as he searched her eyes. No more games, she said. No more fear. Just us. He nodded, his forehead pressing against hers. Just us. The past no longer mattered. The regrets, the betrayals, the years they had lost, it was all behind them now. What mattered was this moment, this choice, and the love that had survived despite everything. Evelyn had once thought that love needed to be fought for, that it had to be earned through sacrifice. But now, as Damien pulled her into his arms, she realized the truth. Love wasn't about power or control. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing again and again every single day. And this time, they would choose each other, forever.